Welcome to Chapter 10 of your Human and Cultural Geography textbook of Space, Place, and Gender. I think this is really interesting because um, I didn't necessarily see the influence of gender in landscapes, and I feel like this really does a great job explaining those influences. Um, well, and we'll discuss it in a moment, especially when we get into the bottom part of the text, which deals more with the landscapes, the physical landscapes, which is something that I never even thought of until much later in my life. But nonetheless, what it says is bring us into the idea of gender. We are now moving towards a social constraint and rule of really of gender pronouns, of what makes people, how does someone identify? Because just because they were born with a particular anatomy doesn't mean that they identify as a particular gender. And so how do we transition and change the labeling that we've had for so long? And so that's what this is really bringing into is looking at gender as not just a language and how do we identify it, but how do we move into a more culturally how are we more culturally sensitive to gender and then into gender inequality. So as you'll learn, and as you'll go through within this text, how do we know what we know? What are the roles of gender? Are there roles? Are there social roles? Are they constraints? When were they set into that effect? Understanding the LGBTQ plus, and we continue to add other acronyms and other letters to that statement, which is a wonderful thing because it's giving people an identity that they can run with. Moving forward with same-sex marriages and the equality and inequality depending on the different location within the world. Unfortunately, we're still dealing with that, but also the evolution of gender roles. If you ever get an opportunity to take a California Indian course, it's quite interesting when looking at gender roles, especially when it deals with sexuality. The Chumash, which is a predominant tribe in California, actually had a name for men that were homosexual. It was called a burdosh, and they were to have somewhat a burdosh in your family was of incredible privilege to have. It was very, very exciting to have the strength of a man, but the sensitivity of a woman is what it was outlined to be, and that was the individuals that stayed with the children and actually raised the children because of all the men were hunting and the women were gathering type situation. You had someone at the house or at the village that had again the strength of a male but the sensitivity of a woman to raise children. It's just very interesting how even at that time culturally sexuality was such an important role. Then moving through the Victorian era, but I think the part that really interested me, probably most of this chapter, is looking at the housing, looking at how we look at the gender landscape of housing and the marketing places. Look about going to different retailers and seeing how pink is for girl and blue is for boy, and that dolls are for girls and that trucks are for boys, and that how that may not be the case. That's really profiling in a sense that anyone should be able to have a doll. Anyone should have. They're called toys. Everyone should have a toy. That there shouldn't be a gender alliance associated with that. And then moving into then the landscapes of um, of of gender, looking at the book uses hair salons versus barbershops. That essentially, at the end of the day, it's a place to get your hair cut, but there is a gender landscape associated within that, which I think is quite interesting. Uh, Moving forward, also with the housing, is that thinking about how architectural design, are there differences in how gender played a role in architectural design going back in time? And the answer is yes. When there's a lot of research showing that when men were predominantly doing architectural design, that the smallest room of the house was the kitchen. But then after the 1940s, when more women were able to get into that workforce, that they designed larger kitchens for larger entertaining. And so there is this interesting gender attribute in that landscape. But then, just like I said, moving forward with this, just gender roles, and I think it's very, very interesting, these perspectives. I shared a video. It's a TED Ed presentation from, I think it's from Canada, but it's essentially two men they're very prominent ballroom and social dancers, and they are giving a lesson saying that could two men dance Could one be a leader, one be a follower, and how can because there are gender roles within that, and how can you break that? And they showed that both men, one can lead, one can follow. They actually dance ballroom and social dancing, where they share that role, and it's very very interesting. I really enjoy it. I think that you'll enjoy watching that as well. Then the last part of the book dabbles in a little bit is just the reality of gender inequality all around. Not just with that, but also then there's also sexual inequality, looking at um, sexual identities and how people relate with that in a social construct, whether it be certain rights or privileges are taken away depending on sexual preference or by gender. And so these are things that, again, we find that in cultural geography, there's a lot of sensitive topics that can be uncomfortable to discuss and to um, bring forth, but they're incredibly important to talk about because that's how we get to learn more about it. You get to learn more about seeing how to be equitable and learning how to be accepting and how to be more open and understanding. Because I think as we find throughout this course that for most people it's just being uncomfortable is what creates that roadblock. But once you learn more and you are more understanding of certain situations because you're being informed, that it changes. Education changes people's mindsets, and so it's very hard to make someone change their mind. But by giving people the tools and the opportunity for that conversation, can make a difference. So, nonetheless, I think this is a very interesting topic. Most human geography books do not cover sexuality and gender, but I'm excited that they do cover this at Cal State Northridge, as it's again something that people don't like to talk about, but I think it's an important aspect to see how this makes an influence on our cultural landscape. So, nonetheless, we'll talk soon.